You're on the Bible Forum. This is the second Sunday in August 2020. Every August in America for the last 75 years, we have taken a moment to remember and to pay homage. Why? In August of 1945, we, as well as others, had been at war with Germany and Japan already for 4 years. It's a war we did not start, a war we did not want. The Japanese had already killed more than 10 million Chinese civilians since 1931 in their effort to take over, and perhaps another 4 million to 5 million Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, and members of the Allied forces since 1940. A mere armistice rather than unconditional surrender would have meant the Pacific War had been fought in vain. Japan's fascist government likely would have regrouped in a few years to try it again, this time maybe on more favorable terms. So here was America's calculus. A planned assault was scheduled to begin on the island of Kyushu in November 1945, and in early 1946 would have expanded to the main island of Honshu. Yet Japan had millions of soldiers at home with fortifications, planes, artillery, just waiting for the assault they knew would come. The fighting in Japan would have made the prior 3 months bloodbath in Okinawa, which formally ended just 6 weeks before Hiroshima, seemed like child's play. The disaster in Okinawa cost the U.S. 50,000 casualties, 32 ships. It was the worst battle losses the American Navy suffered in the entire war. More than 250,000 Okinawans and Japanese soldiers were killed as well. You might ask, well, why did they kill so many? Why didn't they take them prisoner? My dad was on Okinawa. They would not surrender. Would not. They jumped off the cliffs into the rocky shores of the ocean below rather than surrender to Americans. They had been told that we would eat them. Just the street fighting to capture Manila in the Philippines in early 1945 cost 250,000 Filipino, Allied, and Japanese lives. Between April 1st and June 21st, 1945, the battle fought between U.S. and Japanese forces on Okinawa. The largest of the islands in that chain is located just 350 miles south of Kyushu. The U.S. had waged a committed battle along various islands leading from the Philippines to Japan in the South China Sea. The capture of Okinawa was regarded as a vital precursor to a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands. Dubbed the Typhoon of Steel for its ferocity, the battle was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific War, claiming the lives of more than 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese, including the commanding generals on both sides. In addition, at least 100,000 civilians were either killed in combat or were ordered to commit suicide by the Japanese military. The United States could have held off on using the bomb, postponed the invasion, and simply kept firebombing Japan with its huge fleet of B-29 bombers. The planes soon would have been reinforced by thousands more American and British bombers freed from the end of World War II in Europe. The napalming of Tokyo had already taken some 100,000 lives. Napalm, liquid fire. With huge new Allied bomber fleets of 5,000 or more planes based on nearby Okinawa, the Japanese death toll would have soared to near 1 million. The U.S. might have played a rope-a-dope, stood down, let the Soviet Red Army overrun China, Korea, Japan itself, in the same fashion that the Russians months earlier had absorbed Eastern Germany, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. But the Soviet occupation of North Korea alone only led to more war in 1950. their effort in the Battle of Japan wouldn't have helped at all. Had the Soviets grabbed more Japanese occupied territory, more communist totalitarianism and conflict likely would have ensued, and no chance of a free and democratic post-war Japan. Truman could have dropped a demonstration bomb or two in Tokyo Bay to warn the Japanese government of their country's certain destruction if it continued the war. There was no guarantee that these novel weapons, especially the untested plutonium bomb, would actually work. A dud bomb or an unimpressive detonation at sea might have only emboldened the Japanese to continue the war. Also, there were likely only 3 bombs ready in August of 1945. It was not clear when more would be available. So real worries arose that the Japanese might be unimpressed, ignore the warning, ride out the future attacks in hopes that there would be few additional bombs left. And the cruel logic of existential war, demonstrating rather than using a new weapon, can convey to autocratic belligerents hesitancy, seen as weakness, to be manipulated rather than as a magnanimity to be reciprocated. By August 1945, 6 years after the start of World War II in Europe, some 70 million people had already died, including some 10 million killed by Japanese military. Millions more starved throughout Asia and China due to the destruction and famine unleashed by Japan, a brutal military empowered by millions of skilled civilian industrial workers. To Americans in most of the world 75 years ago, each day in early August 1945 that the Japanese war machine continued to work meant that thousands of Asian civilians and Allied soldiers would die. In the terrible arithmetic of World War II, the idea that such a nightmare might end in a day or two was seen as saving millions of lives rather than gratuitously incinerating tens of thousands. It was in that bleak context that Harry Truman dropped the 2 bombs, opting for a terrible choice among even worse alternatives. That from Tribune Content Agency /LLC. The first atomic bomb, they called it Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima in a modified B-29 bomber christened Enola Gay after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Tibbets. The 9,000-pound uranium-235 bomb was dropped at 8:15 a.m. local time, exploding 2,000 feet above Hiroshima. The blast was equal to 12,000 to 15,000 tons of TNT. It destroyed 5 square miles of the city immediately. It's estimated that around 140,000 of Hiroshima's population of 350,000 were killed in that bombing. Around 80,000 people were killed immediately when the bomb was dropped. Over the days, weeks, and months later, the rest succumbed. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb known as Fat Man was loaded on a B-29 bomber called Boxcar, which was flown by Major Charles Sweeney. The initial target was the city of Kokura, but because of thick clouds, the bomb was dropped on the secondary target of Nagasaki. It is estimated that around 74,000 people died in Nagasaki. In Nagasaki on August 9th, around 40,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands of others died in the aftermath from radiation poisoning and other injuries. Due to the massive destruction of the cities, the recorded death tolls are estimates, with other studies saying 66,000 people died in the Hiroshima bombing and that 39,000 people died in the Nagasaki bombing. Many victims died years later as a result of cancer and other illnesses linked to radiation poisoning caused by the bombings. A 1998 study found that an additional 62,000 people in Hiroshima had died as a result of the bomb, bringing the total number of victims to more than 200,000. The Emperor of Japan surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur a week later. Japan was then governed by the U.S. and her capitalistic ideals for many years. Those ideals were embraced by the Japanese, and for the last 60 years or so, they have built a nation into an Oriental powerhouse. On Saturday, August 6th and 9th, we will honor the dead on both sides and remember the awful cost of war, as we have for the last 75 years. Japan has emerged stronger and more vibrant, albeit at a brutal cost. The U.S. has become Japan's strongest ally, strongest partner in the region, and the world is better for it. Our enemies would do well to remember just how the U.S. treats her enemies in war and in peace, and perhaps acknowledge how her former enemies treat us in return.